Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start with thanking Dr. Freeman and Dr. Allison for generous invitation to give this colloquium and for your kind introduction. So I'm going to today talk about a couple of things. Actually, four different topics, so four mini talks. So I'm going to start with the motivation behind the work that I did with a large group of people, most importantly Jorge Rivas and Eugenia Calnay, that I have named as co-authors on this talk. So I'm going to start with basically the basis of coupling human and Earth system models. What is the philosophy, what's the foundation, and why do we do this work? Then I'm going to go right into the Handy model, whose paper was published on April the 2nd and created a lot of buzz all around the world. I went over the media, and I think that's why I'm here. Then there's coupled human climate water model, COWA, which is the real system that we have modeled, and I will show like different examples, different regions that we apply policies, and we'll look at the future of water sources. I'm going to end with just one slide for the final thoughts. Okay, so looking at the growth of human population and consumption. So this graph shows what has happened to the human population here as solid red line, and what has happened to human consumption if we agree that GDP per capita, average GDP per capita can be a good proxy for consumption. So starting from year 0 and going to year 2000, we can see that what has happened, for a long time, and for actually a long time before that year 0, going back to the beginning of agriculture, human population has been pretty much constant, maybe growing very slowly, linearly. But then we get here to around 1700, 1750s, and the beginning of Industrial Revolution and starting using non-renewables and fossil fuels. And then we can see that there has been a, an explosion of not just population, the red line, but also an explosion in consumption. So our impact on our planet is the product of these two factors, population and consumption per capita. So when you think of the impact, you can see that it must be growing at a super exponential rate. Because of this, so we can think of the human system as embedded into the Earth system, because Earth system provides us with the sources for our economic growth, for inputs to our economy, all the materials, energy, and also absorbs all the results of this production, all the emissions, all the pollution. So this whole human economy is part of the Earth system. It's integrated, and it should be integrated with this whole system. Most importantly, because if you look at this, so before, in the beginnings of times until 200-300 years ago, or even like 100 years ago, or some people can argue until 1960s, when you had the super exponential growth, this was the situation. We had small like human system, and the Earth system was huge. So we could basically say that approximate the Earth system as infinite. So we could think of we're living in an infinite world with infinite resources, infinite capacity to absorb all the emissions. And what has happened now is that this little part, human system, has grown to dominate the Earth system. So that's why we need to couple, if we want to understand what's happening with the evolution, with the dynamics of the human system or the Earth system, we need to look at these two coupled together with bidirectional feedbacks. So as a history of Earth system models, what we've had is, starting back in 1960s, first models of the atmosphere were developed by atmospheric scientists and physicists. Then newer parts were added in the following decades. We had land, we had ocean, we had sea ice, multiple parts that were added. But for example, until 1980s, 1986, 6, 7, mid 80s, we had complex atmospheric models and ocean models. And they had interactions through one-way feedbacks. So atmospheric temperatures could change the sea surface temperature, but not other way around. And sea surface or the oceans could change the humidity, but nothing like back to the sea surface. So with those models not being fully coupled, we couldn't predict El Nino or Enzo. El Nino, La Nina, we couldn't predict them. So Mark Kane in the 80s, he developed a simple model that had both atmosphere and ocean, and they were coupled with bidirectional feedbacks. So when he did that, he could predict El Nino a year in advance successfully, and that was one of the biggest discoveries back then, biggest achievements for modeling. So in a similar fashion, what we propose is to couple population and the human system through bidirectional feedbacks to the human system and build a fully coupled human Earth system model, which I will show here. So this is a prototype schematic of that model, which has basically the Earth system itself, atmosphere, land, ocean. There will be a water system in that whole 5-sector model, in agriculture and food, energy and resources, and population. Population and the human as the most important part of the human system. And all of these sectors, they're coupled to each other through bidirectional feedbacks. So basically, for example, population is connected to the water system through feedbacks that goes in both directions, not just one direction. And one of the most important parts of this figure is that top bot's policies. So that's the major difference of a human system and of a coupled human Earth system and the fully physical system or fully natural system. Because a physical system, its evolution is fully governed by the physical laws. So you can't change anything. But when you have a human system, and when you couple it to the Earth system, to a physical system, lots of interactions, they depend on our decisions. So that's why policies act as drivers for this whole coupled system, coupled model. And what we do, we look at different policies, different choices we have for our decisions, and we try to look at possible future scenarios. So policies are what we make. So we make policies based on different things that we see from the system. So we can actually make inputs to the policies, as you say, and we do make inputs. So those policies are based on the evolution of each of these sectors. So those policies, for example, look at a certain variable in the system, let's say population growth, and then determine how should we change that rate. So that would be a policy that is affected by the change of variables in the system. So yes. Question?
All arrows then be bidirectional, basically. Physics certainly is. Everything else is, strictly speaking, bidirectional.
Well, I suppose some people would argue that there's an arrow from waste into policies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is bidirectional.
Because you have to add some bidirectional arrows and unidirectional in parallel. So you see, you're making a subtle distinction somehow.
Right, there are arrows that are only going one way in that chart.
Correct. Yeah, but then we have this like, so there are like the bidirectional is not everything. So not everything can be coupled in a bidirectional way. But the whole point is that the full system will be bidirectional through indirect feedbacks. So it's like impact of an impact that makes it fully coupled. Okay, so with this, I would like to go into a description of the handy model. So handy was our first attempt at understanding these fully coupled systems. So we sat down and we said, what's the easiest way? What's the easiest way to understand the interaction of human population and resource use on this planet? And we started with the predator-prey model, looking at population as a predator and resources as prey. And then we built this model handy. There are a couple of differences. So we thought that the whole population doesn't interact with resources in the same way. So we divided the population stock into elites and commoners. So population was divided into two stocks. And then we introduced an accumulation of wealth. So a new stock that takes the result of physical depletion and physical production and saves it. And then for one of the key results of handy was this notion of carrying capacity that we introduced in there. I mean, it has existed, but we introduced it specifically for handy for this model. And as we'll see later, it proves to be a critical measure and notion for understanding and realizing sustainability. Okay, so what's happening with these collapses? Has there been collapses? Many, many times in the history. Lots of them, they have been unnoticed because essentially those civilizations didn't exist afterward, so they went away. But there are still like hundreds of collapses that have been documented, and archaeologists have found them. Most recent result is from a work that was done in Europe, a multi-million euro project directed by Shannon, also Downey, who's one of the professors at UMD. He was also involved in this project, and they look at a huge body of data, huge collection of data, archaeological evidence at certain sites over the Europe. And they find that there have been 23 societal collapses over past 8,000 years. And this is over those specific places, specific sites that they have looked into. And out of these 23 collapses, they figure out that external forcing wasn't the cause of such collapses, but these collapses happened because of an internal endogenous issue, and that was overrunning carrying capacity of the system. So another interesting result from wavelet analysis of their data is that the time scale for prosperity and collapse, these cycles of the societies were about 300 to 500 years, which happens to be matching the results we get from handy. And then, so with this, I'm just going to go right into a typical collapse scenario from handy. As you can see, so these are the four variables we model in the system. This is like natural resources. This is population of commoners. This is population of elites, or the equivalent population, which is multiplied by this number kappa, which is the inequality factor. And this is accumulated wealth, the gray line, accumulated wealth. And the orange curve here The orange line is our carrying capacity. So when population crosses carrying capacity, we find that in all these experiments, that's the time, that corresponds to the time when wealth has started to decline. And this result gives us a practical way to understand and measure carrying capacity and estimate carrying capacity in a real system. Because in a real system, we don't know like all these parameters in this model, and it's much more complicated, but we can still understand it based on the time that the accumulated wealth starts declining. So going into the model itself, as I said, it's a minimal model with only four dynamical equations, four differential equations. This is XC is the commoner population, XE is the elite population, Y is nature, and W is wealth. So these are birth rates, death rates for elites and commoners, which are different, we'll see shortly. Depends on consumption levels, and because consumption levels are different, the death rates are different. Nature, we assume that it regrows with this logistic function here. And then there is depletion of nature, which goes directly into production, physical production. And then there's consumption for commoners and consumption for elites.
First two equations, you can write beta C minus alpha C, all of that times XC. Would that be correct?
That's correct, actually. The real effect is the difference of those two. But for simplicity, for being, for better visibility in this case, we just kept them separate. And because, people think of birth rates and death rates separately and how they change. So we look at the birth rates and we look at the death rates, and we show that death rates we basically assume that the death rates change. Fair enough.
So there are people who do live forever?
No, it's a rate.
These are the rates.
It's a rate.
It's
Right.
instantaneous
Right.
rate.
Yeah.
Proportional population.
Okay, so here are the consumption rates. As I said, we assume that there's a different level kappa inequality level factor between elites and commoners. So that describes the difference, and consumption decreases as soon as wealth hits a lower threshold. So when there's no wealth, people have to reduce their consumption. But because elites consume at a much higher level, their consumption goes below the critical level much later than commoners. Because of that, we assume that the death rates are proportional to these consumption levels. And because of that, as you can see, the death rates for elites goes into the famine regime much later than the commoners. So this gives that delay. And carrying capacity, that important notion, which is guiding us for the rest of our models, in the water model, in the energy model, in the land and agriculture model. So carrying capacity for handy, specifically within this mathematical structure, we define it as the level of equilibrium population. And it's given is proportional, as you can see, to the regeneration gamma of nature, the depletion factor delta, maximum capacity of nature, lambda, consumption per capita, S, and eta, which is a factor which depends on the death rates and birth rate. So we show that this carrying capacity can be maximized at this level by choosing the depletion factor at an optimal level. So, yeah.
Surely technology affects carrying capacity, right? Denser agricultural practices increase carrying capacity. And I'm not sure I see how that's reflected.
That's true. Yes, we don't we explain in our paper why we don't include technology in this model. First of all, we didn't want to complicate the model too far. Secondly, technology can have both positive and negative impacts. And then technology has multiple things. There is technology for consumption, which can improve our level. I will show it in the next part of the presentation for the water model, how technology can improve water carrying capacity in a region. But there's also technology for extraction. When you improve extraction technology, that actually results in faster depletion. And then there is this rebound effect, Jevon's paradox rebound effect, which is like a social effect, it's an indirect effect, which results in increased levels of consumption when technologies become more efficient. So for those number of reasons, and for keeping it simple, we just didn't model technology explicitly in this work in handy, and that's why basically carrying capacity stays at a constant level for each scenario. All right, so I'm going to go right into the scenarios which we have. So we looked at 3 different types of societies. Well, the first type is the egalitarian society, where we just assume we have no elites. So basically, all the population works, so it's commoners, everybody works, and everybody consumes at the same level. Egalitarian society. And then we look at different possible cases within the society. So first of all, we show we can come to this optimal equilibrium level. So that's a possibility for sure. And population lands to the maximum level of carrying capacity. That's why, so He M is the carrying capacity, and population lands to that level. So this is all perfect. Everything looks good. Then we increase the depletion factor, the production, we increase that. And then we see that, okay, we can cross over the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity comes lower than the maximum because delta is not at its optimal level. So population crosses carrying capacity, but the overshoot is not too large. So it's still like a reasonable overshoot. It just oscillates, comes back down, and eventually converges to the level of carrying capacity. So everything goes into equilibrium, even though it's not the optimal equilibrium. Then if we increase delta beyond that even further, what happens is that the system goes into these cycles of prosperity and collapse. So we'll see these cycles that take about this 400 or 500 years, and then there's like another cycle starting, and it can push the system into those cycles. And fun. So that's the case now. So here it is.
Oh.
So if we push the system, if we push the production level and depletion beyond a certain level, then we can push the system into a full collapse, or type N, as we call it, type N collapse, which in this case happens just because of over-depletion. So it's just over-depletion that is at play. And this is something that other models before Handy, similar models in the same class, models that were published in ecological economics, and it started with the paper of Brander and Taylor. So those models, they all look at over-depletion, and they can show this. However, not those models couldn't do full collapses, and that was one of the things that we realized. After our reviewers told us about it, we figured out that so Handy is special because it can reproduce these full collapses, which those other models couldn't, and that's because of accumulated wealth. So those predator-prey models, they go into cycles. because you directly prey on your resources. And resources go down, the population goes down, and then it keeps oscillating. So it goes into a cycle. When you add this accumulated wealth, what you can do, you can start using, because what you consume is the wealth. So even though when nature's pretty much out, you keep growing because you still have the savings and you rely on those. And with that, you can push the system into a full collapse. So these are. That's actually a comment we received from a anti-NASA lobby in DC that told us, why don't you go to extraterrestrial resources and bring them down here to use them for growth. Yeah.
Accumulated wealth, canned food doesn't last that long.
So you have to take the numbers here with a grain of salt. The fact is, these numbers in reality, in a specific system, depending on what type of resources, they can be back and forth. But the mechanisms, the underlying mechanism which causes this delay would be pretty much the same.
Always exhaustion of resources, or could it be other phenomena like droughts?
Let me show you that. So there could be like another factor, which is inequality, which I will show in the following results. Okay, so let's next go to the second type of societies. So this is for equitable society. So equitable society is basically where we have both elites and commoners. The inequality factor, kappa, equals 1. So which means they consume at the same level. So basically we have workers and non-workers. And we show like, again, the same set of results. So the results we got are robust. We can reproduce them in this case with differences, but still we can have optimal equilibrium where total population goes to your carrying capacity. Then we can have, as long as we don't cross this carrying capacity by too far, we can still converge to that level, to the level of carrying capacity, and observe that, as I said before, in all these experiments, the time that population crosses this level of carrying capacity is the time when wealth starts declining. So that gives us a good proxy for estimating what's the real carrying capacity of the system. Then we go into those cycles of prosperity and collapse, and eventually the full collapse of the system in an equitable society. It happens as before. So this equitable society, we did an experiment. So we figured we said, what's happening if we want to make this system, this very same system, sustainable? Can we make it sustainable by doing anything? Say, changing the ratio of workers and non-workers, basically by increasing unemployment. So one way in this system to reach sustainability is to reduce, total depletion, which can be done by reducing, work hours per week, or average depletion per capita. And the second way we figured out is to increase unemployment rate. And this result resembles, so basically in this case, these are the same things, everything. It's just higher unemployment, and it goes into sustainability. So this sort of resembles results of paper by Knight, Rosa, and Julius Shore, which was published last year. And they looked at data from OECD from 1960s, 70s up until now. And they look at the impact of work hours on sustainability of societies. So it basically shows that sustainability is a result of is change, the unemployment rate can be related to keeping sustainability in a system. As you can think of it, in our paper, we give the example of Germany versus US. Where Germany keeps its unemployment below 5% by reducing work hours per week to 30 hours. And US, we have, much higher unemployment and the work hours are much higher. So this scenario here for the equitable society can show this fact through the simple experiment. All right, so done with these examples, I'm going to go into go back to the very first experiment that I showed, egalitarian society, optimal equilibrium, everything sustainable. Now, I add a small initial seed of elites to this example. And the question is, what will happen if we add this small initial seed of elites here, up to 500 years, which is the timeline here. If we have the 500 years, up to 500 years, everything looks perfect. We seem to be on our path to equilibrium, even though we have that small seed of elites. But what will happen? Any guesses? Yeah, that's true. So this is what will happen. Yeah, so what happens? This is actually one of the other unique results that came from Handy. So this case is basically the previous case, which was fully sustainable, very completely equilibrium. But because of these elites, they grow to larger numbers. They start depleting wealth because they have a larger access. That drives down the population of commoners here. And by driving that down, even though natural resources regrow to their full capacity up here, the system goes into a collapse because labor is gone. And we think of this basically like the Maya collapse, where they had this large inequality. And even though after the collapse, their forests and croplands, they all grew to be very lush. And so this is basically what happens to the nature. So nature grew, but still the civilization, the society collapsed because of that large level of inequality that they had. So this result was, this factor of inequality was a factor that was not considered in the models prior to Handy and those models that go after Brander and Taylor model in ecological economics. So this is type L, because it's labor, basically. Because labor collapses, then the system collapses, type L collapse. And then this is the typical scenario, which I showed in the very beginning, type N, irreversible full collapse of the system where we have unequal society. So this is a situation where system collapses both because of over-depletion. So we have very high depletion of resources, and we have high inequalities. We are doing both of it. So even though we showed that either one of them can independently push the system into a collapse, this one, which is the typical case for collapses like Eastern Islanders or Anasazi or many other collapses in the Gupta, Mauryan, Chinese dynasties, Roman Empire. If you look at most of them, this is what happens. Both high inequality and high depletion per capita. Yeah.
Metrics, your use of chi and gamma, and I can understand, I think, anthropomorphizing those curves with wealth, I should say commoners, elites, and carrying capacity. But I'm a little fuzzy about what it means for nature or wealth. I'm presuming is what, dollars?
So when we measure nature and wealth here, we actually use the same. We use the same units. We called them ecodollars. We invented this units ecodollars because wealth here represents physical wealth. So it's the direct result of depletion, which becomes production. So we call it ecodollars. And
Does that also go though for the anthropomorphized curves of commoners and elites too?
yeah, we should.
And how do those relate to chi and gamma?
To chi, you mean chi? Yeah, chi. Call them chi. I used the original Greek. So carrying capacity chi, as I showed before, it's a function of gamma, which is the regeneration rate of nature, lambda, nature carrying capacity, delta, which is the depletion rate, and S, which is consumption per capita.
So we need to have your simultaneous equations off on the side when we're looking at these.
Not just this particular, but like all of them. Yeah. So in the paper, if you look at that, and if you're interested in all the details, you should look at the paper, and then we can.
Is the source code available?
Yes.
It's written in what?
The source code is available, and the paper is available. Everything is online. It's in Benson. It's in Benson, but it's also available in Python. It's also available in MATLAB in multiple languages. So yeah, but we wrote it originally with Benson.
Quick question.
Yes.
Speaking of anthropomorphizing, whatever. Sounded like, and since you had a predator-prey model, sounded like the elites are your predators.
Somebody actually. So somebody.
Is that jumping ahead?
So actually, somebody said that. We had a.
Well, that's the same effect. They are back.
That's an interesting thing. So somebody said that so elites are, because it sounds like that. Where even some of these articles which were on the news, they had this misunderstanding that elites are the predators.
The mass sense here?
No.
They're the same.
No, the predator is the whole population, basically. It's the human population, not the elites. And
That's two subpopulation, commoners and elites, and one goes away if the other one shows up. That's a predator.
They're predating on nature rather than
predator.
Fine.
Yeah, predator is.
There's predation from the elites and the rest.
Well,
Because they're dying last.
So predators are the whole population. So basically, and prey is the nature, resources. So that's what goes in between, the predation. The predation is between population and nature. It's not between.
Elites being the predators and nature and commoners and wealth, whatever. This basically becomes prey, equivalent.
It's not, but like we can discuss this if you're interested. It's not. So we have one of our reviewers who said that, and we had to explain. And he actually suggested us to call elites lions and commoners zebras. And in our model, elites don't eat commoners. There is no lions eating zebras. So. But I can discuss that after the talk, yeah.
Martin, those are called lockable terror models.
Yeah. For predator-prey, lockable terror. Right. Okay. So, back to this collapses. Is there any hope in an unequal society? Because we know that inequality is essentially a nature of a social system. So, can we reach sustainability in an unequal society? Any thoughts? So, we actually show that yes, we can. We can reach sustainability, as Herman Daly, who's one of the fathers of ecological economics, said in his 10 Commandments for Sustainability a couple of years ago. He said, we have to reduce inequality to a level of 10. So we did that experiment. We reduced inequality to that level 10. But we also had to reduce consumption, and we had to reduce the population growth rates, modifying birth rates, basically. Yeah, lots of other places, or any place that you want to be sustainable, you have to look at these three factors, particularly in handy. So we had to adjust inequality, consumption rates, and population growth. And then we could bring an unequal society into an equilibrium, which is optimal given its situation, a state. And what happens if we overshoot? Well, as before, if we overshoot but don't overshoot by too much, then we can still manage to converge to this equilibrium solution. So like some people say we are already over our carrying capacity of the Earth. Well, is there a hope? We think there is. But as long as we don't start acting too late. All right. So with this, I think I would just go to conclusions from Handy 1. So we use this minimal model basically to understand mechanisms behind different social dynamics, particularly sustainability and collapses of societies. We have this 4-variable model, and we did these thought experiments. And that's what we use Handy for, just for thought experiments that help us understand these interactions and long-term evolution. So carrying capacity was the single most important measure that, through experiments with Handy, shows us where we are in terms of our path and our evolution towards sustainability. And one interesting example was the experiment we did in the equitable societies, and we showed that high unemployment and work hours are directly related to societal sustainability, the example of Germany versus US. And each of the two factors, so this is what Handy got, each of the two factors of ecological strain, there's depletion of natural resources, and economic stratification, which is level of inequality, kappa. Each of them can separately send the system into a collapse. And sometimes we do both of them, then it's going to be even worse. However, we show that, at the end, in other cases, we show that sustainability is definitely possible, but we need to have right policies and right decisions. So, so what's next after Handy 1? We actually already have our...
Because in the 2007, 2006 era, by one definition of employment, the United States unemployment rate was lower than Germany's. They also had reduced work hours, but they had higher unemployment. But there's also definitions of employment for which things change a whole bunch. What if everybody works 45 hours a week, but 80% of the people are writing poetry is their work? And so we have a high poetry consumption, which doesn't really have an ecological effect, if I've chosen poetry correctly.
Called forced retirement.
Well, but so what definition of employment and what definition of consumption are we using?
Excellent question.
Because
So
consumption doesn't necessarily fall in this way.
excellent question. So with these experiments we did here, in the paper of Knight, Rosa, and Shore, they explicitly show, what are these like unemployment data that they use from OECD data. So that's like empirically shown. In this model, the experiment that I showed here was basically unemployment, meaning that if you're into the elites, so elites don't do the physical production. So as you said, those poets in this case would be unemployed because they don't do the physical production. And that one was the definition we used in our experiments here.
True. I mean, there for some, factors unemployed.
Yeah, exactly. And in our experiment, the unemployed, the non-workers in equitable society, they don't consume more. So we assume they consume at the same level. But it's just they're not participating in the physical labor, physical production, and extraction from natural resources. So
We pass around poems and call that GDP.
right. Yeah. So that's true. So they use wealth. So that goes into the consumption.
They're producing and consuming poems, so it's.
So, well, that's good for everyone. Right? Making poems, and we just don't need the physical resources. We need like spiritual resources. So that goes into the spiritual resources, I guess, in this case. Yeah. Okay. So, what's happening with the next generation, next level of handy? We already like looked into a second generation of handy. We've already developed the second generation. A paper is under writing. So what happens with the second generation is that we have, in handy 1, which I showed, we just have regenerating nature. So there's a regenerating nature that keeps regenerating, like forest, crops, fisheries, game animals, those sort of things. So what happens if we add non-renewables, fossil fuels, and renewable flows, which is like solar, wind, things like that. And so we also added the mechanism for investment in accessibility capital. So if we invest in a certain sector of production, then we can improve that, we can have faster production. So we have that accessibility capital added, and then we have labor going into different sectors of production, sector non-renewable, renewable, and regenerating and renewable. And then we added the mechanism for social mobility. So what happens if we add social mobility so elites and commoners can change in between them? So just going to show like only a couple of examples, and results from Handy 2. So this is our classic full collapse, which we had, again, typical collapse scenario. So just look at the timeline. We have about 500 years, the cycle. The population here maximum is like 80,000 people in this, in the units. So, and this is the situation. Now the question is, what happens if we add non-renewables to the system? If we add a larger stock of non-renewables, is that going to prevent collapse? Exactly. Wow. You got the answer. It actually just delays it and has another important impact. So here's the result. We add this non-renewable resources. So we go from 500 years for the timeline. We go to 700 years. So it gives us a delay of about 200, about 200 years, right? So we get about 200 years extra. But another important thing that happens here is if you look at this maximum rate, you remember it was 80,000, now it's 4 million. So we can see that the peak population increases by a factor of 20 in 2030. And if you think about it, what happened if you go back to the very first graph that I showed here in my talk about explosion of population and consumption over the past decade, over the past century, especially like past 50 years since 1960s. You can think about it, somehow, how can it relate to this model, to this thought experiment model, Handy 2, and how come like it can capture that effective maximum, the peak population being raised by about 30 times, and this delay that we get with collapses. So, and finally, we show that what happens with an unequal society if we add renewables. If we switch to renewable sources, again, we'll see that we get another 200 years. So we get another, like, couple centuries extra. But within the system, if you look at it, it doesn't completely prevent a collapse, as long as, because we still have that high level of inequality and no mobility. We show later that if we add mobility, we can bring this into a sustainable state. But so again, it's important that we use renewable sources. It's important that we extract our resources sustainably, and it's important that we have lower inequality and mobility in the society. Okay, so quick results from Handy 2, which we have, these 3 types of nature, mechanism for investment in accessibility, adding non-renewables delayed for 200s and increase the peak by 20, 30 times, and adding renewables delayed for another 200 years. But since we had this inequality, it still pushed the system into a collapse. Okay. So with this, I want to go into my basically third part of the talk. So, which is on the real system, this coupled.
You can eat stored food. So when you have a gap between accumulated wealth, between nature goes to zero, at that point, you're on stored food, not accumulated wealth, because you can't eat accumulated wealth.
Well,
you can eat stored food.
So in this model, the wealth is the physical wealth. So accumulated wealth is a stored food, essentially. Correct.
So,
correct. But we can. And we can keep it for like a couple decades. It can be stored for a couple decades, like grains. If you think about the historical case at the time of Joseph, for example, they stored grains for 7 years, and they could go through a drought for the next 7 years. So it has happened. But as I said, you have to take the numbers with a grain of salt here. But accumulated wealth is the physical.
Wealth can also buy nature.
Accumulation.
So you should plant trees.
oh, but if it bought nature, then nature didn't collapse. And while there might be biblical stories of people storing food for 7 years, I'd like to see some actual examples, some documented examples that are more than 5 years.
Yeah, there have been. Those are documented.
Well, okay, but
those are
5 to 10 years I can buy, but 50 years I can't. Which is all your numbers, 50-year gaps.
Right. In those cases, yeah, that's.
Knocks down the population pretty quickly.
Again, as I said, you have to take these numbers here with a grain of salt. Again, the system, the mechanisms happening are the same. And then you have also this issue of converting, accumulated wealth, somehow back to food. So now, for example, with refrigeration, with new techniques, you can store it for much longer, right? You can store the food for 50 years or 100 years. Yeah, because we have it.
Produce 100 years in advance, which drives your consumption way up.
Right.
So that's kind of awkward too. You can't get there.
And just delay of execution.
The things change as soon as the food production goes to zero. Because one of two things is true. Either you notice that was happening and start producing food like crazy, start storing food like crazy, which drives your nature to zero faster.
Yeah.
Or your population collapses when you run out of food and you're starting to eat people.
It does.
Zombies.
It does.
But it's no 50 years. There's no 50-year thing here.
So it does. If you, your as I said again, I just repeat, I'm just repeating myself. This number, whether it's 50 years or like 10 years or 20 years or something, that's that can be adjusted within the parameters of the model. So, but the mechanisms behind it, the mechanism behind it is still a similar mechanism, which you can, we can store the food for a number of years, or the generally, and you can store the resources for a number of decades, um, and then that can cause this delay in collapses after you have uh, depleted your major resources, natural resources. But as you say, it could happen much faster in reality, and it would. Like the delay is shorter, but the delay could be shorter, but it's still there.
Or historically, so.
Yeah.
Or zero.
Yeah, great. So I'll be happy to discuss this, further after the talk. So going into, so I have to actually rush through this one. So this is the coupled. So what time should I end? 5:30. Okay. Okay, I think I will finish by 5:30. It's only 15 minutes, so. Okay, so, the model I showed in the very beginning, the coupled system, human Earth system model, which I said we are doing five subsystems. We are doing the Earth system, water, energy, agriculture, and population. So out of this 5, so far we've done the Earth system, climate model, water, and population, and we have coupled them together. So we have this coupled human climate water model that we use to, which is called, this is COWA, we call it COWA, coupled water model, and we use it to do experiments. And we apply it to the specific region of Phoenix AMA watershed, or like with these real numbers and data that we get from the region. And we do, like a base run, and then we look at different policies, different water management options. So we run the model from 1900 to 2100, and we look at the impacts of different management decisions. So again, we use a minimal system, minimal model. We focus on simplicity to guide us for understanding all the interactions, so that we are able to understand all those interactions in the system. We have population, those like state variables, population, surface water, groundwater, and freshwater supply, which is reservoir. And we couple to the Earth system through precipitation evaporation. We couple it to a river routing module, RRM, through river flow into the area and out of the area. And population is coupled through demand and change in population growth rates and migration rates. So again, this is a graphical representation of different state variables. As I said, these are the couplings to the precipitation evaporation couplation to the Earth system model, the climate model. River inflow outflow rates coupling to the river routing. There's recharge of groundwater going here. Withdrawal from surface and groundwater. Recycling. The feedbacks here shown with red between available water, which is population growth rate, including migration rates from a region, and consumption and demand, which is determined by population. So this is sort of like a schematic of this COWA, and again shows all those like variables, all the connection and the flow in the system. On this side, you see the Earth system, UMD ICTP Earth system, the land and river routing model, and over here we have the population with all these connections. So this is how we assume again that the population growth rates change. We have this alpha, similar to what you saw in Handy. We also assume that as long as we are above a certain consumption rates, we are at the healthy death rates, and as soon as we drop below that, the death rates increase, and the migration rates have the same story. As long as we are beyond a certain rate, we have population coming into the area, immigrating to the area, and when consumption decreases, population starts to migrate out. So this is one of the key factors here in COWA, where we show what's the impact of long-term policies, why they are needed. We actually show this, I will show in these experiments, that how important all this long-term planning or long-term policies we have. So this is withdrawal of water from surface water or groundwater. And this shows this factor N is that policy knob that we can change and see what happens if we have enough water in our sources for this number of years or this number of months down the road, then we can withdraw as much as we want. If we have less, then we have to reduce it. And then we can change this limit, we can change this threshold by choosing this policy knob and adjusting it. Okay, so going right into the experiments, we did this base run from 1900, as I said, to 2100. We look at these variables. Most importantly, in these experiments, we're going to look at population and groundwater because those are the variables that change most significantly in between different scenarios that we show here. As you can see, groundwater ends up at the level of about 300 ckms here in this experiment, and population ends up as about 13 million people. So we'll go through different experiments and we compare what happens. Okay, first experiment, adding recycling. Recycling is from all of these experiments, recycling is the most effective management option factor that we can add to the system. As you can see, it can increase the population from 13, 14 million here to about 23 million. So it increases water carrying capacity of the system. That's for one thing. And the second thing is that you can look at the final level of groundwater. Instead of ending up at 300 ckms, cubic kilometers, we end up at about 550, which is significantly better. So recycling, number one factor, biggest factor. Then we look at technology, going back to your question about technology. And this is technology in dispensing. So essentially, for example, going from flood irrigation to drip irrigation. So less consumption of water, or going from regular shower heads to conserving shower heads. So with technology, improving technology factor, we can look at these differences. So groundwater goes from 300 to 490, which is still much higher, but not as high as it was with the case of recycling. And population goes to about the same level of about 24 million. So technology definitely can increase the carrying capacity if it's not overcompensated by increased consumption. Okay, what happens with the transfer infrastructure, aging pipelines? So we look at the aging pipelines. If we improve it, we can improve the carrying capacity a little bit. So we go to about, if it's aging, so with worsening some conditions, we end up at about 12 million. And the impact on groundwater is not too large. If we improve the pipelines, we can go to about 15 million instead of 14 million. So overall, it can improve the carrying capacity. And this was an interesting scenario. We had reservoir carrying capacity. So we said that what happens if we increase our size of our reservoir, size of our water towers, and save more water. So we have more water for direct consumption, more capacity to save water for direct consumption. And what we saw was surprising because, even though population, we have a larger reservoir capacity. So with that, population could increase. However, look at this. Look at the groundwater. It goes down to a critical level of 50 ckms, which is dangerous and which is something we don't want. So in the cases that something like this happens, that's where we need those long-term policies. So we need long-term policies because if we change that long-term policy from like 5 years to basically 30 years, something like that, we can get groundwater up to, instead of 50 ckm, we can bring it up to about 150 ckm. So prevent it from going to those critical levels. And at the same time, population ends up being a little bit lower, but it's going to go into level off into a lower sustainable level. And finally, this was a story about, what if we have these uncertainties in our groundwater estimates? Because this happens in lots of places, and we can lose, actually, some places we can lose a portion of our groundwater because of pollution, because of dilution with pollution, with chemicals, and we can lose a portion of it. So if you start our groundwater at half the level, so we are 50% uncertain about our total estimates of groundwater in this region particularly, what happens, as you see, is, well, population keeps growing up to this certain point. However, groundwater goes to like a very low levels of about 5 ckm. And this is really not good. So again, this scenario shows how important it is to have, those long-term plans, long-term planning, long-term stricter withdrawal policies for groundwater sources. So we changed that in this scenario, and we show that, well, population has to drop back down, so it ends up being at 10 million instead of 13 million in that period. But we can bring up the level of groundwater from 5 ckm, which is really unacceptable, to something like around 40 ckms. So again, this example shows how important it is that we plan for not just 1 year, 5 years, but for longer future. Question? Yes.
Yeah, you're breaking water out as freshwater, groundwater, surface water, and I think it's important for people to talk about fossil water as well, because that is not renewable. And the sum of freshwater, groundwater, and surface water, those are just feedbacks into wherever you choose to draw from. Yeah, but and big parts of our agricultural system are dependent upon fossil water, which has no feedback or renewal worth thinking about.
Right.
And so I think that, anyhow, I think that's
Yes.
misleading in here.
No, excellent question and suggestion. So groundwater here sort of acts as sort of like a fossil fuel because its rate of replenishing is pretty slow. So in those places where you're talking, fossil water, we're pumping some water out and it's not going to be replaced, and we're using, energy to pump it out, fossil fuels to pump it out. So that groundwater essentially includes that water. But as you said, we can, in some versions of the model, you can separate those break them into like finer distinction stocks.
I think it's important that people make decisions thinking about groundwater as renewable, where they're really talking, in one hand, about fossil water,
Yeah.
which is not renewable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Well, have you, I know.
If you just let
Yeah,
me
go ahead.
finish this because we have like 3 minutes and I want to just get through this. So this is actually the last slide. So, I can again show a comparison of all these different experiments we did, different policies and different management options that we looked at. So we can see that, all of these things, recycling technology can increase, the population, the water carrying capacity of the system, and they can conserve water sources. And then we looked at this surprising scenario for higher reservoir capacity that that could lead to dangerous depletion of groundwater sources. However, we could prevent that with strict withdrawal policies, long-term policies, and these policies are also important when we had high uncertainty in our estimates for the groundwater sources. So in conclusion, for this, we have, we can make these models that looks at long-term impacts of water management options, such as, recycling, technology, transfer infrastructure, reservoir capacity on the system, on the coupled, human water system, human climate water system. But we have to have these bidirectional couplings of water with population in order to see all these non-trivial interactions and non-trivial evolutions of the system. So it is important, we show that it's very important to have long-term policies for water reserves, and we can show in future works that this should be for all the cases. And something related to your question about fossil fuels. So the next level, the model we are working on right now, is actually an energy model that is fully coupled with COWA. So we integrate the next sector of our 5-sector model together with COWA, with coupled human, climate, water, and energy. So that's the next level. Okay, so I think with this, I would like to conclude my talk. I had a slide for final thoughts, because I was told that this is I have to give some connections for the computer sciences students. And I had final thoughts, but I think we're already cut off. Maybe Andy, are we cutting off at 5:30 sharp or 5:35?
We'll take the video now.
So
You finish up, and then we'll...
well, I can go with this one. The final thoughts I had. Maybe I just show it and I quickly talk about it. So for all the students, all the students in computer science and in other, other hard sciences, what I think is important is we need to work together, earth scientists, computer scientists, hard scientists, they have to work together more closely with the policymakers, with the decision makers, and with social sciences. So because we are all, we are all here to serve humanity in general. So we have to provide our services to everyone. And in order to do that, we need to make smart decisions. We need to make smart policies because we are dealing with the human system. And as I showed, human systems greatly depend upon our decisions. Their evolution greatly depends on our decisions. So computers have helped, over past century, even shorter, half century, I should say. They have helped with so many different endeavors of mankind. We're using computers in systems, in lots of modelings, in markets and economics. We are using it for so many different things. In healthcare, we're using computers for basically lots of different things, and we could and we should use it a lot more frequently for making better decisions. So that's that's my goal, and that's why, I try to connect, public policy with systems modeling And that's, I think, is a place where there's lots of work to be done. There's lots of opening, and I think all the students can look into that as a possible option for their future work. All right. So I want to thank you again all for your attention and for your time. And I would like to, with this, I would like to open the floor to more questions. Thank you. Yes,
So have you shown this to the people in Sacramento, Department of Water Resources?
I have not.
I can arrange that if you'd like.
I would be happy. I will be here until Saturday, until Sunday actually. But, so if they want to do it,
Well, no, the problem is you'll have to go to Sacramento, is the thing. I mean, they have a $2 billion system.
Wow.
And the like. I think your model is probably a little on the simple side for that.
It is simple, but still, the whole point of us doing the simple models is, we know, like, for example, all these integrated assessment models. They exist. They have been around for years. They're complex, and like GCAM, for example, that's developed as DOE, PNML, IGSM at MIT, Mirage, Image, Message, all of those models. But I've commonly seen when people at these places, they present their work, they present, their analysis, lots of times we see this thing happening here. We don't really understand why or how it happens. We don't understand, all this feedback because we have these thousands of parameters, thousands of variables, and, those models, they serve a purpose. They're very accurate. They're trying to, go with all the data. But sometimes you can't see all these, bidirectional feedbacks and interactions in the system. So this model, yes, it is a simple model, but you can clearly see, what's going on, what variable changes the evolution path of these other variables, and in what ways.
See, in case of Phoenix, you're using the urban model. The state of California, on the other hand, it's a couple orders of magnitude larger because it's multiple urban areas, and it's largely due for control of the Central Valley, where the interests are heavily agricultural, which Phoenix is not. And I've been in meetings, certainly, where you'll say something about a stream going through somebody's property, and they don't care. They don't give a rat's ass who's downstream from them. That's largely that's how water is governed in this state.
I see.
Mark Twain said it best: whiskey is for drinking, and water is for fighting.